Hey, welcome back to lecture number 4 for Phil 110. Today we're going to talk about Karl Marx, human alienation. Now, I would be decently surprised if any of you have not heard of Karl Marx because he's a pretty well-known, not just philosopher, but political theorist, social scientist, activist, historian, you name it. Unfortunately, the reputation that Marx does tend to enjoy in the United States is not that well, and we'll get into some reasons for why that is. But yeah, let's jump right in. So, Karl Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, Germany, and he was from a family of Jews who converted to Christianity, mostly to escape discrimination, because at the time, Jews in Europe often faced immense persecution from various governments who wouldn't, enfranchise them or give them other legal rights and whatnot. Um, but even though his family converted to Christianity, they weren't particularly religious. And Marx's father was actually a lawyer who was deeply influenced by the Enlightenment, which we talked about in the last lecture with Kant, especially this idea of sort of secular liberal humanism, right? In Marx's early career, Marx also, I believe, got his degree in law. But in his young life, Marx was involved with this group of philosophers and activists known as the Young Hegelians. And the Young Hegelians were young scholars, generally those on the left side of the political spectrum, who tried to take up Hegel's ideas and apply it to the struggles for like liberalism and democracy in Europe at the time, right? And Hegel was a well-known German philosopher that mostly did his stuff right before Marx was around. Um, but although Marx was deeply influenced by Hegel and was deeply influenced by his time with the Young Hegelians, he was very disliking of what he considered to be their idealism, right? And he saw that even though they had all these great ideas about democracy and freedom and emancipation, they were pretty disconnected from the day-to-day life of the working class, right? But while Marx was a young Hegelian, he met and befriended Friedrich Engels, who would go on to become his lifelong friend, co-author, and comrade. And with Engels and a whole cast of characters, Marx was a lifelong communist theorist and organizer. He was a founding member of the International Working Men's Association, or the First Internationale, which was this international organization composed of communists, socialists, anarchists, people involved in the labor movement, that sought to sort of bring about a working class revolution in Europe and eventually the whole world, right? Um, During Marx's life as an activist, he moved all around Europe to escape persecution. No matter where he went, he tended to not last long there because he'd be so provocative and he'd try to stir up workers to revolts that a lot of the European governments would just kick him out. But eventually he did settle in London, England. But by the time Marx got to England, he was effectively rendered stateless, so he did not have any citizenship anywhere. And during Marx's entire life, he lived in squalor. Because he was so involved in the communist cause, he focused mostly on organizing work at the neglect of his own family. He wasn't really a great father. He wasn't a good husband. All the sort of reproductive care work, he would let it fall on his wife and her sort of allo mothers. And when Marx died, he died heavily impoverished and stateless. But some notable works that Marx wrote included economic and philosophic manuscripts, a section of which you read yesterday, Grundrisse, The German Ideology, The Communist Manifesto, which is probably his more well-known work in the United States, 3 volumes of Capital, and so on. So, as many of you already know, Marx's ideas, or Marxism, has had a huge impact on at a global scale. Marxism is perhaps the most influential, if not the most, is one of the most influential, if not the most influential, political philosophies in modern history. In 1922, when the Soviet Union was established, the Soviet Union became the first avowedly communist country or communist state that was founded on Marxist principles. Um, and one of Marx's ideas for his political theory is his idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Which is this idea that during times of revolutionary transformation, the working class will take political power and oversee the transition from capitalism to socialism and then eventually to communism. Um, After World War II, when the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany, Marxism became very influential for anti-colonial movements around the world, if not before. During the mid 20th century, what we often call the Cold War in the United States, various formerly colonized or semi-colonized countries declared independence, and many of the organizations that led that movement were founded on Marxist principles. So some examples are China, Vietnam, Cuba, and Angola. And at the height of the communist movement, which is probably somewhere around the 70s and 80s, about a third of the world's entire population was living under a communist government. And in the United States in particular, Marxism has had a long history of both achievements and hardships. Uh, this happened in a series of two, maybe three Red Scares that occurred, especially during the 1950s under McCarthyism, when it became practically illegal to be a communist in many ways, right? Um, that being said, though, a lot of the sort of progressive figures in U.S. history were Marxists, if not influenced by Marxism. So you had the Communist Party USA, which is a pretty notable communist party here in the U.S., if not the world. You also had the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which merged elements of the Black radical tradition with Marxism to fight for racial equality and the destruction of capitalism in the United States, specifically within Black communities. But even also many unions in the United States, including the AFL-CIO or the IWW or UAW, and so on. A lot of their early founders or early members were also themselves Marxists or communists. So things like a 5-day work week, things like a 40-hour week, things like minimum wage, pensions, all that. You can thank Marxists for that, right? Um, but obviously, during the collapse of the Soviet Union in the Eastern Bloc in 1991, um, those events led to a regression of Marxism at a global scale. So Marxism became out of fashion, so to speak, during the 90s and 2000s, when it was thought that a liberal democracy and capitalism was inevitable. There's a really famous philosopher called Francis Fukuyama, who actually came to the University of Oregon not too long ago, who wrote in the 90s that capitalism and liberal democracy is the end of history. Right. That being said, though, after a couple of decades of regression, Marxism, or at least socialist ideas, are making a comeback, especially among younger Americans. So, according to a 2020 poll, roughly 36% of Americans say that they view socialism either somewhat or very favorably, right? And as socioeconomic inequalities continue to grow at a very unprecedented level, a lot of people, both within academia but also within organizing spaces, are starting to go back to the works of Marx to study capitalism and the sort of problems produced by capitalism. Okay. So the section that one of the pieces that we read from Marx, Estranged Labor, was a section of a series of collected writings called The Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts in 1844, which, as the title implies, was written in 1844. But it was one of Marx's first major writings on capitalism. But although it was written during Marx's early career, it wasn't published until after Marx's death in 1932 in the Soviet Union. Beforehand, it was a relatively unknown text. And in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, Marx provides a critique of both Hegelian philosophy as well as classical political economy. Hegelian philosophy is a philosophical tradition that's influenced by the works of German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, who we briefly mentioned a few minutes ago. And Hegel's philosophy is pretty renowned for being very difficult and complex. But the TLDR of his philosophy is that he understands history or sort of philosophical concepts like reason, for example, to fundamentally be a sort of historical concept that progresses through dialectical movements. right? And because Marx himself was a young Hegelian in his young life, Marx is deeply influenced by Hegel, and he's particularly influenced by Hegel's idea of the historicity of reason, right? But Marx thought Hegel was nonetheless too idealist and too speculative, whereas Marx is more of an empirical thinker, sort of grounded in the day-to-day activities of ordinary um, working people, right? Classical political economy, which we're going to focus a little bit more on here today, refers to, to the works of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and John Stuart Mill. And classical political economy is basically an old way to say what we today call economics, right? Um, so although the classical political economists didn't really have a concept of capitalism, they thought that they were just writing about the economy, quote unquote, right? One of Marx's important contributions to the field of economics is him saying, it's not like throughout history humans have only had one economic system that had the same, more or less the same practices of production, distribution, consumption, reproduction, etc. Just as humans change politically, humans change culturally, technologically throughout history, the economy, the economic systems of humans also changes as well, right? So capitalism, didn't exist for most of human history. Capitalism is a relatively recent phenomenon, and it's not something that we can just sort of unquestionably regard as something that's here to stay. Um, but Marx did think that classical political economy is very revolutionary. He, in fact, in many ways preferred classical political economy to what he saw as a sort of idealism or speculism of German philosophy. But unlike German philosophy at the time, Marx thought that classical political economy suffered from the opposite problems, that it was too ahistorical, right? Um, and so the economic and philosophic manuscripts is where we get um, some of Marx's earliest articulations of his critique of capitalism, which he would later develop more forcefully in his 3 volumes of Capital. Okay. So some quick definitions. Capitalism, again, is a very complex concept, and you'll hear different definitions. But as far as Marxists are concerned, capitalism is a mode of production or an economic system, if you'd like, that's predicated on the private ownership of the means of production and the incessant accumulation of capital. So, just because there's private property, just because there's private ownership of the means of production, that doesn't in itself make it capitalist. What makes it capitalist is if those who own the means of production do so they can accumulate more capital, which they then use to then accumulate more capital, then to accumulate more capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a never-ending exponential growth, right? And obviously, capital is what produces wealth for the capitalist. So if you're a capitalist, it means that you own the means of production. Sometimes Marx uses the term bourgeoisie. They're not quite synonymous, but for our present purposes, we can treat them as synonymous. But the capitalist and the bourgeoisie is a class of people that owns the means of production, right? And oftentimes this is owned as private property. That private property doesn't mean just things that belong to you. So, this book right here that I own isn't private property itself. iPhone isn't private property itself. Those would be more things like personal property, right? Private property is more things that have a social value. So things like forests, things like factories, things like or things like universities, right? Those are properties that can be privatized, right? They have a social benefit, and they involve social labor, but they're only owned by one person or a group of people. Right? On the other hand, you have the worker or the proletariat. And the worker is those class of people who do not own any means of production. They only own their own labor, which they sell to the capitalists in exchange for wages, right? But the wages that they do receive tends to almost always be an extremely small fraction of the total wealth that's produced in the production process, right? So obviously, between the capitalist and the worker lives in a much more precarious position because whereas the capitalist owns their own means of production, they own wealth, they own access to all these things. The worker at the end of the day owns nothing but their own labor. And the crux of Marx's critique of classical political economy was that he thought that it tried to naturalize capitalism by ascribing to it these general laws that are actually produced by capitalism. They aren't the conditions for the possibility of capitalism. Things like production, things like supply and demand, things like distribution, Say's law, all these economic laws are not trans-historical laws that apply to every single economic system that we've ever had in history. They only really come about through capitalist social relations, Marx wants to argue. Um, and the problem with that is that classical political economists tend to be biased or skewed toward the interests of capitalists, and they take things like competition or economic competition to be a natural fact about humans without necessarily questioning why that's the case. So a good example of this, if any of you took economic classes, like you hear all kinds of things like this, right? But the way, for example, that economists will try to explain the emergence of money, right, is that, long time ago in this unspecified time and place, there were these two people. One had a goat, one had wheat, right? The one who had wheat wanted some milk, so he went to the guy that had a goat, and the guy that had a goat needed a wheat for his bread. So then they started trading things, but because things got too complicated to keep up with, then all of a sudden people just invented money to be able to keep tabs of all the exchanges that they made, right? But for Marx, this is just a purely sort of speculative origin myth that economists or business people like to make up to sort of justify the present practices that we have. And for Marx, things like money, things like, wages, things like capital, these things have a history, and oftentimes the history is very violent and bloody, and not this sort of innocent origin like the political economists like to pretend that it is. So here's a quote from Marx, quote, "Do not let us go back to the fictitious primordial condition as the political economist does when he tries to explain. Such a primordial condition explains nothing. He merely pushes the question away into gray, nebulous distance. He assumes in the form of fact of an event what he is supposed to deduce, namely the necessary relationship between two things, between, for example, division of labor and exchange. Theology, in the same way, explains the origins of evil by the fall of man. That is, it assumes as a fact in historical form what has to be explained, right? So basically, he's accusing classical political economists of begging the question or of circular argumentation, right? They're trying to prove they're trying to prove something by taking the conclusion of the argument as a premise. And so, Marx thinks that's just philosophically problematic. Okay. So, capitalism, forces workers essentially to live in objection, right? Because the entire purpose of the worker's life is just to produce commodities for the capitalists. And in that process, workers themselves become commodities. And the worker is commodified because, they sell their labor on the labor market, in order to survive, right? They really don't have a choice. They might have a choice in this very, limited sense of, yes, they can obviously choose not to work, but, if the worker doesn't choose, if the worker chooses not to work, then what happens? Well, they starve, they become homeless, they can't support their families, right? So it's kind of a choice by gunpoint, essentially. And in the production process, so when workers are at work, the thing that Marx really finds to be interesting about capitalism is that the products of workers' labor become alienated from them, and alienated means it becomes outside of yourself, right? And a good example to illustrate this is like the difference between an artisan versus a factory worker, right? So before capitalism, right, producers tended to have this sort of intimate relationship with their workplace. If you were a carpenter, you'd go into your shop every day, and you'd create this wonderful chair. You would take your time making it. You'd be proud of your work. You might sell it, but you have this sense of ownership over your own work, right? Because you're an artisan. In some senses, that's your life. But when you're a factory worker, you don't necessarily have that same connection to the product of your work. You're, on the tailor line every day, kind of doing very repetitive work, doing very exhausting work, very tiring work. and you don't necessarily even have a direct sort of relationship to the things that you're making. Um, it just becomes packaged and sent off to enrich your boss, essentially, right? Um, so the factory worker is a new type of worker that, in many ways, is more fungible, is more expendable, in ways that are, in some senses, unprecedented, right? So he has this quote here, quote, all these consequences are contained in the definition that the worker is related to the product of his labor as to an alien object. For on this premise, it is clear that the more the worker spends himself, the poorer he himself, his inner world, becomes. The lesser belongs to him as his own. The alienation of the worker in his product, means not only that his labor becomes an object, an external existence, but that it exists outside him, independently, as something alien to him, and that it becomes a power of its own confronting him. It means that the life which he has conferred on the object confronts him as something hostile and alien, unquote. Um, so in this piece, Marx then names the three aspects of the alienation of labor, right? And the first that which we just talked about is that the worker feels alienated from the products of their own labor, right? So hopefully most of you have had a job in your life, but if you worked a normal wage job, whether it's in the service industry or whether it's in direct manufacturing, in either case, you don't have the sense of ownership, you don't have the sense of empowerment at your workplace. When you're working at a restaurant, a short order restaurant, you're just there sort of grinding it out the whole day, right? You might have some sense of pride in your work, but there's not the sense of self-ownership that you have, right? In the same vein. The second is that the worker feels alienated from the production process. So what that means, basically, they feel alienated at their own workplace. They don't feel at home when they're at work. And before capitalism, in most parts of the world, there wasn't really such thing as a work home or work life distinction. Work was just kind of imbricated in everyday life, but work wasn't as demanding back then as it is under capitalism, right? If you were a farmer, you woke up, maybe you worked for a few hours, then you'd rest for another few hours, maybe take a nap, go back out, do what you need to do, come back, right? But there wasn't this sense of constant sort of go, 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 go. So what that meant, you didn't really have a work-life distinction. Whereas in capitalism, a worker who doesn't have land to go back to, a worker who doesn't own a home, a worker who doesn't own anything except for their own labor, they wake up every morning at 5 a.m., they take the train to the factory, they clock in, and they just stand at the line for 12 hours a day. Marx's time at 12 hours a day, you're doing the same thing, you're doing backbreaking work. Then they go home, rest, and repeat the process all over again, right? So you don't feel a sense of accomplishment or homeliness at your job. And importantly is that, under capitalism, if you're a worker, if you're proletarian, the work that you do is to satisfy the enrichment of others, right? You're not working because you're trying to better your community. You're not working because you're trying to better your level of subsistence, right? You're not working to do all these sort of things that are more fulfilling. You're working because you're doing the work to make the capitalists that hire you richer, right? And finally, Marx spends a little bit more time talking about this, and this is and maybe especially interesting philosophically, is that he thinks that the worker feels alienated from nature itself under capitalism. And Marx describes humans as what he calls a species being. And a species being, in the sense, is this idea that humans are self-reflective social creatures that have the capacity to produce what he calls inorganic nature by appropriating things from organic nature. So, for example, unlike other forms of life or unlike other animals, humans, we don't just kind of gather things. We don't just sort of live off the land in this very direct way. We don't just, hunt and repeat the process every day. We're a little bit more creative than that. We build things. We, cut down trees to build villages. We, dam rivers to, divert the water source away towards our community. We build cities. We build a lot of things, right? So we build this entire inorganic nature around us through both nature, but also importantly for Marx, from our own labor, right? So humans, in this sense, are naturally creatures that labor. And in that sense, labor should be self-enriching. Labor should be emancipating. Labor should be something that's a source of pride. But under capitalism, it's not, right? And especially in the context of mass industrialization under which Marx was writing, humans become more and more disconnected from their environment. They become more disconnected from nature or the natural world. Um, so obviously, at the time of Marx's writing, most of the tended to be, former peasants who were driven off their land by capitalists, and then they went to the cities looking for work. When you spend more time in the city, and when you are closed off in a dark factory in a dark room for days on end, you're just completely disconnected from nature. Your entire purpose is to just be a cog in the machine, so to speak, right? Um, so finally, jumping forward a couple decades, and so the second reading that you have from Marx, Fetishism of Commodities, is a section from Capital, Volume 1, which is probably Marx's magnum opus. Um, and in that in this piece, Marx tries to describe or to consider the ways in which commodities under capitalism have this weird kind of cultural or social status that in many ways sort of serves nefarious interests, right? So under commodities are things that are produced to be exchanged. And so that means that they have both use values as well as exchange values. Use values are things that we value because they're useful to us, right? And exchange values are things that have value because they're valuable in terms of their exchangeability. Um, and for Marx, commodities have both elements, but there's especially the case that exchange value is what's important here. Um, and so, for Marx, what's nefarious about the fetishism of commodities is that in capitalism, commodities, again, when they become alienated from the labor of the worker, commodities kind of take on this almost sort of mystical, magical form where it seems like they just have value in themselves, right? And what that does is that then commodities obscure the social relations that underpin its condition for the possibility of it being produced, right? So this is a pretty kind of standard critique of what we would maybe today call consumer culture, because instead of seeing commodities as products of someone else's labor, we see them as things in themselves that are devoid of the sort of context of why they were created. So, for example, a great instance of this would be like Gucci t-shirts, right? I mean, the t-shirt was probably just made in a factory somewhere in Southeast Asia or South Asia by workers who are exploited by the company that makes them. But because Gucci has this sort of social capital, so to speak, right? They just stamp the word Gucci on that relatively affordable commodity, and now they mark it up for hundreds and hundreds of dollars because when it comes on the shelf, then the Gucci T-shirt kind of has this magical aura that people just become so obsessed with obtaining and accumulating, even though at the end of the day it's just someone else's labor that went into making it, if not multiple people's labor that went into making it. So the implication of Marx's theory of human alienation is that humans were inseparable. Human nature is inseparable from our own labor, right? Especially our own labor within our environments. So far, the people that we've read, like Hobbes, Rousseau, and Locke, they all have very interesting theories of human nature, but none of them really talk much about labor, maybe except Rousseau, and Rousseau did influence Marx, as you might be able to tell. But for Marx, he thought that labor is at the center of what it means to be human, right? We're not just sort of passive creatures, we're actively working and actively reshaping our surroundings. And second, human nature is not absolute, it's not immutable. It's in many ways contingent on the social relations of a given mode of production or a given stage in society. So by that token, for Marx and Marxists, human nature is not, naturally greedy or naturally good. So oftentimes, when economists or past scholars have tried to justify capitalism, they'll say something like, well, capitalism is the best system that we can get because humans are naturally greedy. So you need a economic system that can reward greed or at least tame greed to make it somewhat beneficial for the rest of society, right? But again, Marx thought this was just a speculative, idealistic, really unhelpful way to study human nature. Marx that nature is plastic, is predicated on our work, on our labor.